Zephyr Teachout is a tour de force, and New York is very lucky to have her. I looked up her family on Ancestry.com. I was trying to figure out all of this background. I mean, the Teachouts came here, I think, from the Netherlands. Even before there was the Netherlands, it was the Dutch colony of Spain in the 18th century, and they showed up in New York. About, as far as I can tell, about sometime in the 1780s, they turn up going to Vermont for a long period of time. And there's a whole line of really talented teachouts who show up in Vermont. And then Zephyr turns out to be surrounded by lawyers. Her father is a professor at con law in Vermont. Her mother is a judge, I believe. And she's been not only a Yale graduate, but also a lawyer from Duke for some time. She's a professor at Fordham. She ran for office 3 times and can tell us all about what that was like. She got very close and nearly defeating Andrew Cuomo and getting 34% of the vote, and then ran for Congress after that, and then finally the attorney generalship in 2018. She is the author of Break 'Em Up, which you have been referred to. She's also an actress who has starred in.
What were you looking up?
One of my favorite plays, which is Beckett's Happy Days.
It's one of my favorites too. Yes, I've done it a couple times.
So I'm going to turn it over to you because time is short, and we can hear more about all this later. But we also, Nick will follow up after that with a discussion of finance curse, and I look forward to this very much. So thank you, Zephyr.
Oh, well, thank you for being here, and for Thomas and James, just to get a sense of what's the best way to organize this half hour. I have a few different models here, but I'd love to get your sense. You know, this is the seminar, obviously.
I think it's interesting to talk to you about how you came to this subject.
Yeah.
You know, the growth of corporate power in America.
I guess how much do you want me to talk at you, and how much do you want discussion? That's the real question.
These students are not shy. They will always raise hands, and they've been taught to do that using the Zoom paraphernalia.
Right. Okay, great.
So they will jump in and ask questions. I'm sure Harrison, Enzo, we'll hear from a bunch of them, tough questions, and you can be ready.
Okay, great. Great. Well, I want to welcome that, because my experience of Zoom is that those features of theater that can accompany a lecture are missing. and therefore, the more interaction, the better. Less of a sermon and more of a discussion.
Great.
So I came to focusing, which has been my focus for the last few years, on antitrust and more broadly anti-monopoly law, and I'll talk about that, because of both my activism, working on political campaigns. I've both run for office and also worked on campaigns really since my early 30s. So for about 20 years, we worked on Howard Dean's presidential campaign and then a lot of local campaigns. And then my scholarship up until recently was very much a democracy scholarship. I would argue that it still is, but just to understand where I came from. So I was writing about the meaning of corruption, the history of the meaning of corruption. I'm very much an Americanist. I always love talking to people from with other backgrounds, but that is my scope and of study. And so looking at the realm of what we call in the legal world law of democracy, and it became very clear to me that the contemporary set of tools that we think about as the democracy tools, campaign finance reform, which I care enormously about, gerrymandering, which I also care enormously about, voter suppression laws, all those are incredibly important. But they actually create a silo around some of the biggest democratic issues that we face, which are concentrations of private power. So one way to think about it, and I'm talking to, a group of people who are well versed in thinking about language of justice and the language of democracy is that we've had really for about 50 years in the United States, a profoundly formal understanding of government, as opposed to a functional understanding of it. So we have looked at what is government by looking at who is the mayor, who is the president, who are the Congress members, as opposed to every word of mine is getting transcribed, which has a fascinating psychological effect. Do you know about this? I suddenly want to speak with semicolons and
speaking to the masses, speaking to eternity. This is timeless.
And more complete sentences because I see the immediate transcription. So the formal approach is to then think about law of democracy as the study of what we think of as the formal elected government, and the functional approach is to really study power and who has governing power. So the first piece I wrote on this, I actually wrote with Lena Khan, who is tomorrow about to be nominated to the FTC. This is before she had even gone to law school. She was my policy director for my 2014 run for governor and a dear friend. And we were writing about this kind of puzzle of when should we think of corporations or what we think of as private sphere organizations playing a governing role. And so if there's a few key points that I want to get across in my book. One is that we have to understand something that has long been understood but then forgotten, which is something that Justice Douglas said in the 1940s, that all power tends to form into a government in of itself. And so we should look at those places where there is governing power and look skeptically on that governing power when it isn't controlled by the public. I don't think the line is easy. That's always true when you have a functional approach as opposed to a formal approach. But I do think when you look at companies, for instance, like Amazon, they play a lot of the roles that we think of as governing roles. Their relationship, not just to the warehouse workers, where they have not only power over their own workers, and this is recent research that's come out in the last 3 months. I haven't written about it. There's been some nice news stories, but Amazon's terms at its warehouses effectively set the terms at other warehouses because they have so much power in the market, right? So this is a regulatory role setting to wages and terms of employment, not just for warehouse workers, but also for drivers. Their power over delivery has ended up setting terms in the delivery sphere. And it's an area that I'm watching very closely. I think you see a lot of evidence that Amazon has a real interest in saying, okay, where's some money we can make? There's a industry where wages are $35 an hour, let's make it a $15 an hour industry, sort of because they have figured out ways to control the delivery sphere and therefore reduce the wages. The place in which it's most noticeable is Amazon's power over sellers. The small business owners who sell on Amazon are the largest block of small business owners in the country. And Amazon's power to dictate terms is extraordinary. It includes the power to set the price. If like Jamie, if you're selling, I don't know, bolts, and Amazon decides to sell them at $8, they have effectively set the price for your bolts, because if you set them higher anywhere else, people will come to Amazon. So they are basically price setting, not just in the book industry, but across the board. They're using their power atop this market to deeply investigate how businesses work and what businesses do well. And so famously have studied successful businesses and then copied them, competing directly against the businesses who work on them. And then they use this choke point monopoly power. I don't think I've even used the word monopoly. I'm talking about this sort of governmental power, monopoly power to effectively demand a private tax. Sellers pay on average 30% of every sale to Amazon because they have that capacity. So Amazon's just one example of this private form of governance that is, as I argue in the book, not just dangerous for our economy, but it's a really fundamental threat to democratic self-governance. It's a form of government that coexists with democratically elected governments. That's one key argument in the book. When it comes to sort of legal tools, and I want people to jump in and ask questions. Just to give you a sense of the scope, we're talking about 500,000 global mergers in the last decade. And these are not, there's a lot of small mergers, but we are also talking about Dow and DuPont, Amazon and Whole Foods, really extraordinary, Walmart and Bonobos, really extraordinary large-scale combinations. And once you see these through the lens of power, not sort of siphoned off into democracy is here and economic questions are here, then you see that we should actually think about these things in Shakespearean terms. These are the political marriages that are occurring in our society that we should pay attention to. And that some of the costs of this kind of concentration, and there are myriad costs. One of the costs I think there's growing attention to is the way in which concentration in the tech sphere and the business model has sucked the business model for working class journalism dry, and local journalism. Poughkeepsie Journal. I don't know how the New Haven Register is doing, but it's sort of a direct assault on a business model for something which is fundamental to democracy, and at the same time, Facebook and Google sit atop and play a role as basically directing the informational streams of our society. And as I've argued both in the book and then a lot more since then, because there's been a lot of debate about Trump and the enormous amount of toxicity on these platforms, there is a deep, deep authoritarian temptation that those on the left, I think, can easily buy into, which is to act as supplicants to these companies to ask them to take down the individual posts which they find abhorrent. Which may in the short term be valuable, but actually really entrenches them as governing, and governing in a way where there's no really a coherent theory of accountability, unless you really think of ethical consumerism as a coherent theory of accountability, which maybe I can fight with some of you guys about. I do not, especially in a monopolized world. You want to boycott Facebook, you wander over to Instagram owned by Facebook, and the individual consumers may feel proud of such a boycott, but for small-time retailers, local businesses, people seeking jobs, these are not meaningful options. The boycott is only available to a handful of people of means. And not something that can work on a broad scale, and not a serious, it's not a serious mechanism of government to say boycott is our way in which we are going to sort of use sticks to make sure that Zuckerberg and Pichai actually control our information sphere in a way that we think allows for a thriving democracy. It's actually the debates we have about should Zuckerberg have done this or not are to me so maddening, because they are very far away from why should we allow Zuckerberg to have this level of power, and we should take responsibility for the kinds of speech that we want to allow and the kinds of speech we don't want to allow, instead of both getting the advantage of shaking our stick, but without the weight of the public responsibility that comes with democratic self-governance. Another of the costs that I think gets way too little attention, and they're substantial costs, are the deep racial inequalities that have flowed directly and indirectly from the massive merger wave of the last 40 years. David, I see you have a hand up.
I did. I wanted to ask a question. It's funny. I mean, this notion of antitrust and more aggressive regulation of the FANG companies is a very hot topic. Obviously, I hear all sorts of interesting opinions, including earlier today, someone told me they should be regulated like utilities. So I wonder, can you give and I think that's an interesting answer, by the way, because much of the discussion on antitrust seems to call for like a new paradigm to regulate these guys rather than just thinking of them as a utility. But I wanted to know, what would be your specific plan to clamp down on a Zuckerberg? Do we need an FCC for the social media industry? Do we need to break them up and have Instagram be a standalone business? What is the path more of a kind of a legal one where we're breaking up companies, or is it something much more technical where we're auditing their technology stack and getting really deep into the weeds?
Great. Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to use it to sort of give a worldview as well, which is that I do think that antitrust, and I'll take some blame for it. The title of my book is Break 'em Up. So it sounds like it's just about antitrust in limited sense of horizontal breakups, breaking up Amazon from, breaking up Facebook from Instagram. I actually do think that many, not all, many of the tools are tools that pre-exist and that tech is not as different as people think it is. There are some features of tech, in particular surveillance and data, which exaggerate problems of power, which make the problem of not allowing concentration choke-pointed power even greater. But they are not fundamentally different. And so I bring an anti-monopoly perspective, which includes, as the suite of tools, and very much as a connected suite, as they were understood to be in the 1880s and 1890s, not a disconnected suite. Antitrust horizontal breakups, antitrust vertical breakups, antitrust limitations on vertical restraints. So Amazon can break off from the warehouses, but if it still has a lot of contracts that it effectively controls them, in the way that Amazon uses vertical restraints to suck value from sellers. And then what is sometimes called public utility regulation, there's sort of a cluster of kinds of solutions that say, okay, the one thing that's illegitimate is radically concentrated private power because there's no significant democratic mechanism. But what you can have is a real need for industries, probably because of what we now talk about as sort of network effects and the values of that. There is a real need for having concentration in those industries. And so you could talk about this in terms of common carriage or utility. Let's just use the utility framework because I think it's quite helpful, which is to say, and the old utility framework, not the modern one. Some public utility people just, like, public utility is this really interesting, plays this really interesting rhetorical role. And I don't feel like I've gotten on top of whether to give it a bear hug or to run away from it because it's played this, like sometimes it's been, we want to regulate it as a public utility, wink, wink, we want to nationalize it. Like that sort of code for that. And sometimes it's, we want to regulate it as a public utility because we don't want to nationalize it. It really means different things to different communities. It's really interesting. So I'll talk about the principles, whether or not it's a public utility or not. The principles are, if you have something that is essential to society, sort of essential infrastructure, and particularly democratic infrastructure like communications, it's important that there not be conflicts of interest embedded in it. So you can't have cross ownership. So let's just take search or social media as an example, right? So Facebook can exist, and maybe we want to not have 20 Facebooks, just 3 or 5. But it can't cross own. It can't also own the mail. It can't also own Messenger. It can't also use a business model, which we've never allowed for essential infrastructure, targeted advertising. That would be sort of basic, and I've written about this, that if you applied the public utility model to Facebook, that basically says you can't use behavioral advertising. Like that's, you wouldn't use that. You've never said that public libraries or the mails or anything that plays this essential public role can use a business model that's built on toxicity. And then you have principles of equal access, like net neutrality kind of principles. And what those mean in there's different versions of that. One is like, you can't have promoted content treated differently. But my model would be 4 or 5 Facebooks split off. Like if you're going to be a social media company of a certain size, you can't also cross own. And you are subject to what you would call, David, public utility regulation. And I say that these are connected because I actually do think that I think this is changing, but when you look at most of us anti-monopolists that sort of split between the Brandeisians, there's a three camps. There's like the Brandeisians, the socialists, and the Chicago school, who are suddenly realizing that even on their own terms, it's a problem. You know, and I'm probably halfway between the socialists and the Brandeisians. But I think that people do read it, and especially press reads it as breakup or, as opposed to like, these are both tools that have traditionally gone together as essential complements to each other. Our question in healthcare, for instance, is do we want to nationalize it or break it up? We just can't allow it to be concentrated in the way it is. That's the one illegitimate mode of being. And so to even step back further, I think of the anti-monopoly project as including antitrust law, agency law, public utility law, corporate law, labor law is absolutely essential. And Professor Sanju Tapal has done some really great writing on this. Like, you can't disconnect thinking about antitrust law and thinking about labor law. They're both laws that govern who can coordinate with whom, and what are the legitimate modes of coordination. So that's a long answer, but
another question, because time is short, and you have anybody else? Harrison, Enzo, there he is.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My question is based on the excerpt we read for today's class. It's the one on monopoly versus democracy. And to me, just from the title, it seems as though monopoly and democracy are incompatible. And it basically goes to the sphere of just like public goods and services. Do you think it would be better, like you mentioned, for governments to nationalize or monopolize certain services, or should we leave it in the sphere of public, not public, but like private competition instead?
Yeah, I mean, my first title for my book was "Who Will Make the Shoes?" It came out of frustration, frankly, and in some ways with talking with young activists who didn't have a vision of like, who's going to grow the carrots, who's going to grow the shoes. And so I think the answer is yes, both. I think it is absolutely essential to have vast swaths of production that are not government run. And I think that the fantasy that's meaningful in terms of power as well, that power imbalance as well, just as labor law is, and yet I think that there's some industries that absolutely should be nationalized. So, and I don't actually think that there's a simple, there's a modern utopian vision that we can, there's somebody I dialogue with sometimes who gets really frustrated with me. He's like, okay, so what's the category of things we should nationalize? Like, can we discuss in the abstract what those are? And I think the answer is no, we can't. It's not an abstract question. And these are public choices to make. If we think, for instance, that our healthcare system, which I happen, a big supporter not only of Medicare for all, but expanding the Veterans Administration, expanding the scope of directly provided health services. We should absolutely be doing that, and breaking up the private hospital monopolies and the for-profit hospital monopolies, by the way, like the the chains of Catholic-owned hospitals that are absolutely dominant in huge swaths of the country, owning a huge proportion of the healthcare industry. It's not just that it's for profit; it's that it is private. So I think that we should, in every area, say, do we public utility nationalize or break up? But what we don't do, and so you're exactly right, is that I argue that the one thing that is incompatible is concentrated private power. That's the one thing that is incompatible. And so then you go industry after industry and say, what works here? But there is definitely a challenge to the left in saying, okay, what is the vision for the private production of goods? And I think it is an anti-monopoly policy that values the dispersion of economic power as a positive value. And that dispersion includes strong coordination of labor rights, but that it does not mean the public production of most goods and services.
Let me get Harrison's question here.
Hi, yeah, thanks as well. Thank for speaking. I don't know how well. I'll just ask one question, seeing as you're pushed for time. Obviously, everyone speaks about big tech, which is fine, but it seems like there's perhaps a more pressing problem is the monopoly a select few hedge funds and private equity firms have on capital that's going into big tech and into future big tech and all the rest of it in the US. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about those firms and that problem in particular and what we should be doing there?
Yes, I do. Chapter 8, called The Money Power. Again, the sort of calling on the language. Right? Some of the language I found really valuable from the 1880s American activists. So here is the thought, the key thought. Yes, there are some rules, and I think of financialization and monopolization as each supporting each other. Right? There's a dynamic interaction there, and that absolutely a return to an understanding of the corporation as a creature of the state is important, as opposed to this, like there's sort of some deep foundational public work we need to do. When it comes to finance, I guess what I want to say is, yes, there needs to be direct regulation of finance, but one of the best ways to regulate finance is to not make it possible to make money through monopolization in the way that we do now. It's not the only way, but it's a way that is sometimes missed. So if you look at SoftBank, or if you look at other companies that are leveraging real weaknesses in our structural system to basically build up moats and then collect, extract all value. The one key way to take on financialization is to change anti-monopoly laws. It's not just to change the laws of finance. Does that make sense, Harrison? Okay.